Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Briarfield Township, Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1953 descended upon Briarfield Township with an unusual severity that seemed to mirror the darkness settling over this small Pennsylvania community. Located in the rolling hills of Westmoreland County, this rural township of barely 400 residents had always prided itself on the predictable rhythms of agricultural life and the quiet dignity of families who had worked the same land for generations. The main thoroughfare, known simply as Township Road, connected scattered farmsteads to a modest commercial center consisting of Henley's General Store, the Briarfield Methodist Church, and a post office that doubled as the community's social hub. It was against this backdrop of rural tranquility that the case of Cordelia Ravencrest began to unfold, though at the time few residents understood they were witnessing the beginning of what would become one of Pennsylvania's most perplexing and disturbing criminal investigations. Cordelia Ravencrest was a 42-year-old woman who operated a boarding house on the outskirts of Briarfield Township. The establishment, known locally as Ravencrest Manor, occupied a three-story Victorian structure built in 1897 by her grandfather, Maximilian Ravencrest, a businessman who had made his fortune in the coal industry before retiring to the countryside. The property consisted of the main house, several outbuildings, and 23 acres of woodland that provided privacy and isolation from the nearest neighbors. According to township records, Cordelia had inherited the property in 1948 following the death of her aunt, Perpetua Ravencrest, who had operated the boarding house for nearly 30 years. The establishment catered primarily to traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, and occasionally individuals seeking temporary lodging while transitioning between employment or dealing with personal difficulties. The boarding house typically maintained 5 to 8 residents at any given time, though the exact number varied depending on the season and economic conditions. Neighbors described Cordelia as a competent but somewhat reserved woman who managed her business with professional efficiency while maintaining appropriate social distance from both her tenants and the broader community. Barnaby Whitlock, who operated the neighboring dairy farm, later told investigators that Cordelia followed strict routines in operating her establishment, posting detailed house rules for tenants and maintaining consistent schedules for meals, cleaning, and other household activities. The social dynamics surrounding Ravencrest Manor were complex and reflected the community's ambivalent relationship with transient populations. While the boarding house provided necessary services for travelers and temporary workers, many longtime residents viewed it with suspicion, seeing it as a source of potential instability in their ordered rural community. This tension was heightened by the fact that Cordelia rarely discussed her tenants with neighbors and maintained strict policies regarding privacy and confidentiality. The Ravencrest family had always occupied an unusual position in Briarfield Township's social hierarchy. While they possessed considerable property and maintained their business with apparent success, they had never fully integrated into the community's social networks. Maximilian Ravencrest, despite his wealth and status, had been known for his preference for privacy and his reluctance to participate in community activities. This pattern had continued through subsequent generations, with family members maintaining polite but distant relationships with neighbors. Local records indicate that the Ravencrest family had also been associated with several unusual incidents over the years. In 1923, a tenant at the boarding house had disappeared without notice, leaving behind personal belongings and an unpaid bill. In 1934, another tenant had been found dead in his room under circumstances that were never fully explained, though the death was officially attributed to natural causes. In 1941, a traveling salesman had reported to local authorities that he suspected other tenants at the boarding house were engaged in illegal activities, though he was unable to provide specific details and left the area before a formal investigation could be conducted. These incidents had been treated as isolated occurrences at the time, and no pattern was recognized that might have suggested systematic problems at the establishment. However, they would later prove significant when investigators began examining the full history of Ravencrest Manor and its operations. The case that would transform these isolated incidents into evidence of a larger pattern began on January 18, 1954, when Postmaster Gerald Stinson noticed that mail delivery to Ravencrest Manor had been accumulating for more than a week. In a community where mail delivery served as a reliable indicator of normal activity, such accumulation was immediately noteworthy. Stinson mentioned his observation to Sheriff Clarence Decker during the sheriff's routine visit to the post office that afternoon. Sheriff Decker, a methodical man who had served in his position for 15 years, approached such matters with characteristic caution. His initial visit to Ravencrest Manor on the evening of January 18th revealed no obvious signs of disturbance. The building appeared secure, with all doors and windows properly closed and no evidence of damage or forced entry. However, when Decker knocked on the front door and received no response, he noted several unusual details that would later feature prominently in the official investigation. The most significant observation was the complete absence of any activity within the building. No lights were visible, no sounds of movement or conversation could be heard, and no smoke rose from the chimneys despite the cold weather. For a boarding house that typically maintained several residents, such total quiet was highly unusual. Additionally, Decker observed that newspapers had been accumulating on the front porch, suggesting that no one had been present to collect them for several days. Concerned by these observations, Sheriff Decker decided to enter the building to conduct a welfare check. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual given Cordelia's known attention to security. Inside the building, Decker discovered a scene that was simultaneously mundane and deeply unsettling. The main floor of the boarding house appeared to be in normal condition. The common areas were clean and properly arranged. The kitchen showed no signs of disturbance, and the dining room was set for the next meal, though dust had begun to accumulate on the place settings. However, a thorough search of the building revealed that it was completely empty. Neither Cordelia nor any of her tenants were present, and there was no indication of where they might have gone. More puzzling was the condition of the individual rooms. Each of the 8 bedrooms in the boarding house contained personal belongings that appeared to belong to tenants. Clothing in closets and dresser drawers, toiletries in the shared bathrooms, books and personal items on nightstands and desks. Several rooms contained suitcases that were only partially packed, as if the occupants had begun preparing for departure but had been interrupted before completing the process. In Cordelia's private quarters on the 3rd floor, Decker found evidence of a similar pattern. Her personal belongings remained in place, including jewelry and a considerable amount of cash in a strongbox that had been left unlocked. Her winter coat hung in its customary place, and her daily clothing appeared to be complete, suggesting that she had not departed on a planned journey. The most disturbing discovery was made in the basement of the building, which Cordelia had used for storage and household functions. Here, Decker found evidence of a meal that had been prepared but never served. Large pots containing soup and other food items sat on a wood-burning stove that had long since gone cold. The food had spoiled, creating an unpleasant odor that pervaded the basement level of the building. Sheriff Decker's preliminary investigation suggested that all occupants of the boarding house had disappeared simultaneously, leaving behind their personal belongings and abandoning activities in mid-process. The absence of any signs of struggle or forced departure made the situation particularly puzzling. It appeared that 9 individuals had simply vanished without any indication of where they had gone or why they had left. The initial investigation, conducted over the following week, involved interviews with neighbors and local business people who might have had contact with Cordelia or her tenants. This process revealed several important details about the boarding house's operations and the behavior of its occupants in the days preceding their disappearance. Barnaby Whitlock reported that he had noticed an unusual decrease in activity at Ravencrest Manor beginning around January 10th. Normally, he observed tenants coming and going throughout the day, walking to the village center or working in the property's gardens. However, in the week before the discovery of the empty building, he had seen no such activity. Additionally, he mentioned that smoke from the building's chimneys, typically visible throughout the winter months, had ceased several days before Sheriff Decker's visit. Martha Henley, who operated the general store, provided information about the purchasing patterns of Cordelia and her tenants. According to her records, Cordelia typically visited the store twice weekly to purchase food and household supplies for the boarding house. However, her last visit had occurred on January 8th, and she had purchased only a small quantity of items, far less than would be required to maintain the establishment for more than a few days. More intriguing was information provided by Reverend Augustine Morse of the Briarfield Methodist Church. Reverend Morse reported that Cordelia had visited him on January 12th, requesting what she described as spiritual guidance regarding difficult decisions. According to the Reverend, Cordelia had been unusually agitated during this visit, speaking about obligations and family responsibilities that she found increasingly burdensome. She had also made cryptic references to inherited duties that conflicted with her personal conscience. Reverend Morse's account of this conversation suggested that Cordelia had been experiencing significant emotional distress in the period before her disappearance. However, she had been reluctant to provide specific details about the nature of her concerns, speaking in vague terms about family traditions and expectations that she felt unable to fulfill. The conversation had ended with Cordelia requesting prayers for strength to do what is right, though she did not clarify what actions she was contemplating. These interviews established a timeline suggesting that the disappearance had occurred sometime between January 12th and January 18th. However, they did not provide any clear explanation for why Cordelia and all of her tenants would have departed simultaneously, leaving behind their belongings and abandoning the boarding house without notice to neighbors or local authorities. The investigation expanded when Sheriff Decker decided to examine the background and identities of the missing tenants. This process revealed information that transformed the case from a simple missing person inquiry into something far more complex and troubling. Records found in Cordelia's office indicated that the boarding house had been occupied by 8 tenants at the time of the disappearance. However, attempts to verify the identities and backgrounds of these individuals revealed significant inconsistencies and anomalies that suggested the situation was not as straightforward as it initially appeared. 3 of the tenants had registered under names that, upon investigation, proved to be false. The identification documents and references provided for these individuals either could not be verified or were found to be fraudulent. 2 other tenants had provided accurate identification, but had given false information about their employment and reasons for staying in the area. Only 3 of the 8 tenants appeared to have provided completely truthful information about their identities and circumstances. More disturbing were discoveries made during a thorough search of the tenants' rooms. Hidden among the personal belongings in several rooms, investigators found items that raised serious questions about the activities and intentions of the missing individuals. These items included false identification documents, maps of the local area marked with unusual symbols, and collections of newspaper clippings documenting unsolved crimes and missing person cases from various locations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. In one room, investigators discovered a suitcase containing what appeared to be surveillance equipment, binoculars, cameras with telephoto lenses, and detailed notes describing the daily routines of various Briarfield Township residents. The notes included information about when specific individuals left their homes, their typical routes of travel, and periods when their properties were unoccupied. Another room contained materials that suggested the occupant had been conducting some form of research into local history and property records. Maps of the township showed property boundaries and ownership information, while notebooks contained detailed genealogical information about local families, including the Ravencrests and other prominent local families. Most troubling was the discovery in Cordelia's private quarters of a collection of documents that revealed the true nature of her boarding house operation. Hidden in a secret compartment within her bedroom armoire, investigators found records indicating that Ravencrest Manor had been used for purposes far different from legitimate boarding house services. These records documented a system in which individuals seeking to disappear or assume new identities were provided with temporary lodging, false documentation, and assistance in relocating to other areas. The operation had apparently been in existence for several years and had served clients from various backgrounds, including individuals fleeing legal troubles, personal difficulties, or other circumstances that made it necessary for them to abandon their previous lives. The documentation also revealed that this operation was part of a larger network extending throughout Pennsylvania and into neighboring states. Cordelia maintained correspondence with contacts in other locations who operated similar establishments, creating a system that could facilitate the movement of individuals across wide geographic areas while helping them avoid detection by law enforcement or other parties who might be seeking them. More disturbing were indications that some of the individuals assisted by this network were fleeing serious criminal charges. Police records found in Cordelia's files suggested that several former clients had been wanted in connection with violent crimes, fraud, and other serious offenses. The network appeared to have served as a resource for individuals who needed to disappear quickly and completely, regardless of the reasons for their desperation. This discovery transformed the investigation into Cordelia's disappearance into a much broader inquiry into criminal activity that extended far beyond Briarfield Township. Sheriff Decker contacted state authorities, and by February 1954, a team of investigators had been assigned to examine the full scope of what appeared to be an interstate criminal operation. The expanded investigation revealed that Ravencrest Manor had been a significant node in a network that had operated for at least 15 years. Records indicated that hundreds of individuals had received assistance from the operation during this period, and many of them had subsequently vanished completely from official records. Attempts to trace these individuals revealed that most had successfully assumed new identities and had never been located by law enforcement. However, the investigation also uncovered evidence of a more sinister aspect to the network's operations. In several cases, individuals who had sought assistance from the network had subsequently been found dead under suspicious circumstances. These deaths had occurred in various locations and had been attributed to different causes, making it difficult for local authorities to recognize any patterns or connections. A detailed analysis of these cases revealed that the deaths typically occurred within 6 months to 2 years after the individuals had received assistance from the network. The circumstances varied, but all involved individuals who had been living under assumed identities in locations far from their original homes. In some cases, the deaths appeared to result from accidents or natural causes, but the frequency of such incidents suggested that something more systematic might be involved. Further investigation revealed that these deaths often occurred when the individuals had begun to establish stable lives under their new identities, or had attempted to contact family members or friends from their previous lives. This pattern suggested that the network maintained some form of ongoing surveillance of its former clients and took action to prevent them from compromising the operation's security. The realization that the network had been involved in multiple homicides elevated the investigation to a federal level. FBI agents joined the inquiry in March 1954, and the scope of the investigation expanded to include similar operations throughout the eastern United States. However, this expanded investigation faced significant challenges due to the sophisticated nature of the criminal operation and the extensive precautions taken to avoid detection. The network had been structured in a way that limited the information available to any single participant. Individuals like Cordelia operated independently, maintaining contact with other nodes in the network only as necessary to facilitate the movement of clients. This compartmentalized structure meant that the discovery of one operation did not necessarily compromise the others. Additionally, the network had been careful to avoid creating permanent records that could be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. Most communication between different parts of the operation had been conducted orally or through coded messages that were designed to appear innocuous. Financial transactions had been conducted in cash, and client records were kept in forms that could be quickly destroyed if necessary. The investigation was further complicated by the fact that Cordelia and all of the individuals present at Ravencrest Manor at the time of their disappearance remained missing. Despite extensive searches and investigations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, no trace of these 9 individuals was ever found. Their disappearance appeared to be permanent and complete, suggesting that they had successfully activated the same systems that had been used to help their clients vanish. However, the investigation did produce some significant results. The discovery of the network led to the identification and arrest of several individuals operating similar establishments in other states. These arrests disrupted the network's operations and led to the closure of multiple facilities that had been used for illegal identity transformation services. The investigation also resulted in the solution of several unsolved criminal cases. Information found at Ravencrest Manor provided leads that enabled law enforcement to identify perpetrators of crimes who had been assumed to be permanently beyond the reach of justice. In some cases, individuals who had used the network's services were located and arrested, leading to convictions for offenses that had been committed years earlier. By late 1954, federal investigators had concluded that they had identified the basic structure and operations of the criminal network, though significant gaps remained in their understanding of how it had been organized and funded. The absence of key personnel, particularly Cordelia herself, meant that many questions about the network's operations could never be definitively answered. The investigation was formally concluded in early 1955, though several aspects of the case remained active in federal files. The Ravencrest Manor property was seized by the government and remained vacant for several years while legal proceedings determined its disposition. Eventually, the property was sold to a development company that demolished the Victorian mansion and subdivided the land for residential construction. However, the case attracted significant academic attention, particularly from researchers interested in organized crime and identity fraud. Dr. Lysander Pemberton, a criminologist from the University of Pennsylvania, published a comprehensive study of the case in the American Journal of Criminal Justice in 1957. His analysis provided the most detailed public account of the network's operations and their implications for understanding sophisticated criminal organizations. Dr. Ruhl Pemberton's research suggested that the network represented an early example of what would later be recognized as organized crime's expansion into identity fraud and document counterfeiting. His analysis indicated that the operation had been remarkably sophisticated for its time, employing techniques and technologies that would not become common in criminal enterprises for another decade. The study also examined the social and economic factors that had enabled such an operation to exist in rural Pennsylvania. Dr. Pemberton argued that the combination of geographic isolation, limited law enforcement resources, and community customs that emphasized privacy and non-interference had created an environment where sophisticated criminal activity could operate with minimal risk of detection. Academic interest in the case continued through the 1960s, with several researchers using it as a case study in various aspects of criminal organization and law enforcement techniques. However, by the early 1970s, the case had largely faded from scholarly attention, and public interest had moved on to more recent criminal cases. The story might have remained a historical footnote, except for a discovery made in 1963 by a construction crew working on a residential development on the former Ravencrest property. While excavating for the foundation of a new house, workers uncovered a buried metal container that had been carefully concealed beneath the location where the mansion's basement had been situated. The container held documents and materials that had apparently been hidden by Cordelia before her disappearance. These materials provided new insights into the network's operations and revealed information that had not been available during the original investigation. Most significantly, they contained records indicating that the network's activities had been far more extensive than previously suspected. The newly discovered documents showed that the Identity Transformation Network had operated branches in at least 12 states and had maintained active operations for more than 20 years. The records also revealed that the network had served not only individual clients seeking to assume new identities, but also organized crime groups that needed to relocate personnel or hide assets from law enforcement. More disturbing were documents indicating that the network had been involved in what appeared to be systematic murder-for-hire operations. Clients who became liabilities or who threatened to expose the network's activities were eliminated, often months or years after they had received the network's services. These eliminations were carried out by specialists who traveled throughout the network's territory, making the deaths appear to be the result of accidents, natural causes, or random violence. The discovery of these documents led to a renewed federal investigation in 1964. However, this investigation faced even greater challenges than the original inquiry, as nearly a decade had passed since the network's activities had been disrupted. Many potential witnesses had died or disappeared, and much of the evidence that might have been available in 1954 had been destroyed or lost. Despite these limitations, the renewed investigation did produce some results. Several additional cases were identified in which individuals who had used the network's services had subsequently died under suspicious circumstances. In some of these cases, enough evidence remained to establish that the deaths had been homicides, though the perpetrators were never identified. The investigation also revealed that some components of the network had continued operating after the closure of Ravencrest Manor. While the Pennsylvania branch had been eliminated, similar operations had emerged in other states, apparently managed by individuals who had been connected to the original network. These new operations used many of the same techniques, but had been restructured to avoid the vulnerabilities that had led to the discovery of the Pennsylvania operation. Federal investigators worked for 2 years to identify and disrupt these continuing operations. By 1966, they had succeeded in closing several additional facilities and arresting a number of individuals connected to the network. However, they acknowledged that other components of the operation likely remained active, possibly having learned from the mistakes that had led to previous discoveries. The investigation was once again officially concluded in 1967, though federal agencies continued to monitor for evidence of similar operations. The case files were classified and archived, and public information about the investigation was limited to basic facts about the original disappearance at Ravencrest Manor. Throughout this period, the fate of Cordelia Ravencrest and the 8 individuals who had disappeared with her remained unknown. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of any of these people was ever found. Federal investigators concluded that they had most likely been killed to prevent them from providing information about the network's operations, though their bodies were never recovered. However, this conclusion was challenged by a development that occurred in 1968. A woman identifying herself as Cordelia Ravencrest contacted federal authorities through an intermediary, claiming to be alive and willing to provide information about the network in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The contact was made through a lawyer in California who claimed to represent the woman but refused to provide details about her location or circumstances. Federal investigators were skeptical about the authenticity of this contact, as they had no way to verify that the woman was actually Cordelia Ravencrest. The lawyer provided some information about the network that had not been publicly disclosed, suggesting that his client did have inside knowledge of the operation. However, much of this information could have been obtained by someone who had been involved with the network in some other capacity. Negotiations continued for several months, with federal authorities offering various forms of immunity in exchange for information that would lead to the identification and arrest of other network members. However, the woman's demands became increasingly specific and unrealistic, leading investigators to suspect that they were dealing with someone who was not actually Cordelia, but who hoped to obtain benefits by claiming to be her. The negotiations ended abruptly in early 1969, when the lawyer announced that his client had decided not to cooperate with the investigation. He provided no explanation for this decision and refused to maintain contact with federal authorities. Subsequent attempts to locate the lawyer revealed that he had disappeared from his California office, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. This incident marked the final chapter in the official investigation of the Ravencrest Manor case. Federal authorities concluded that they had exhausted all viable investigative leads and that further efforts were unlikely to produce significant new information. The case was classified as closed, though files remained available for reference in connection with other investigations. The site of Ravencrest Manor continued to be developed for residential use throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The residential neighborhood that replaced the Victorian mansion showed no obvious traces of the property's history, and most residents were unaware of the criminal activities that had once been centered there. However, some unusual incidents occurred in the neighborhood that led to speculation about possible connections to the past. Several residents reported finding buried objects in their yards, metal containers, unusual tools, and documents written in codes that could not be deciphered. Most of these discoveries were attributed to the property's agricultural history or to random accumulation of debris, but some investigators wondered whether they might represent evidence of network activities that had not been discovered during the original investigation. More intriguingly, several residents reported unusual visitors to the neighborhood. Individuals who claimed to be researchers, genealogists, or historians, but who seemed primarily interested in the specific location where Ravencrest Manor had stood. These visitors typically asked detailed questions about the property's history and appeared disappointed when residents were unable to provide the information they sought. In 1982, one of these visitors was identified as a former federal investigator who had worked on the original Ravencrest Manor case. When contacted by local authorities, the retired investigator explained that he maintained a personal interest in the case and periodically visited the site in hopes of discovering new evidence that might resolve some of the unanswered questions. He denied that his visits were connected to any official investigation, but acknowledged that other former investigators shared his continuing fascination with the case. This revelation led to speculation that federal authorities knew more about the Ravencrest Manor case than they had disclosed publicly. Some researchers suggested that the network had been more extensive and sophisticated than had been revealed, and that ongoing investigations might be pursuing leads that had not been made public. These suspicions were reinforced by the discovery, in 1985, of documents in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania that related to Dr. Pemberton's research on the case. Among the papers was a folder containing correspondence between Dr. Pemberton and federal investigators that had never been published or disclosed. This correspondence suggested that Dr. Pemberton had access to information about the network that had been classified and that his published study had revealed only a portion of what he had learned during his research. The correspondence also indicated that Dr. Pemberton had been contacted by individuals claiming to have information about Cordelia Ravencrest's fate. Some of these contacts had provided details about the network's operations that seemed credible, but Dr. Pemberton had been unable to verify their accuracy or authenticity. The correspondence suggested that he had continued to receive such contacts throughout the 1960s and 1970s, but had never been able to develop them into reliable sources of information. Dr. Pemberton died in 1978, and his personal papers were donated to the university library. However, the folder containing the federal correspondence had been sealed with instructions that it not be opened until 1995. When it was finally opened, researchers found that it contained not only the correspondence, but also Dr. Pemberton's private notes about aspects of the case that he had never published. These notes revealed Dr. Pemberton's belief that the network had been far more extensive than federal investigators had acknowledged publicly. He had identified what he believed were connections between the Pennsylvania operation and similar activities in more than 20 states, suggesting that the network had been a truly national organization with significant resources and sophisticated operational capabilities. More disturbing were Dr. Pemberton's notes about what he believed had happened to Cordelia Ravencrest and the other missing individuals. Based on his analysis of network operations and communications he had reviewed, he concluded that they had not been killed but had been relocated to other parts of the network where they continued to play active roles in its operations. According to this theory, Cordelia's disappearance had been a planned relocation designed to prevent her from being captured and forced to reveal information about the network. The 8 tenants who had disappeared with her had been other network operatives who had been present at Ravencrest Manor for operational reasons, and who had been evacuated along with Cordelia when it became clear that the facility was about to be discovered. Dr. Pemberton's note suggested that this evacuation had been carried out with such efficiency and thoroughness because the network had anticipated the possibility of discovery and had developed detailed contingency plans for protecting key personnel. The fact that no trace of the missing individuals had ever been found indicated not that they had been killed, but that they had been successfully integrated into other parts of the network under new identities. This interpretation of events was supported by Dr. Pemberton's analysis of incidents that had occurred at other suspected network facilities in the years following the Ravencrest Manor discoveries. In several cases, facilities had been abandoned just before they would have been discovered by law enforcement, suggesting that the network maintained surveillance of law enforcement activities and evacuated threatened locations before they could be compromised. However, Dr. Pemberton's theory was never published, and the evidence supporting it consisted primarily of circumstantial connections and patterns that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Without direct evidence or testimony from network participants, it was impossible to verify whether his analysis was correct or whether it represented an elaborate theory that exceeded the available evidence. The disclosure of Dr. Pemberton's private research renewed academic interest in the Ravencrest Manor case, and several researchers in the 1990s attempted to conduct follow-up investigations. However, these efforts were hampered by the passage of time and the continued classification of federal investigation files. Most of the original investigators had retired or died, and many potential sources of information were no longer available. One significant development occurred in 1998 when renovation work at a church in western Pennsylvania uncovered a hidden room containing documents that appeared to be connected to the Identity Transformation Network. The documents included client records, operational procedures, and communications that suggested the church had served as another node in the network's operations. The discovery was particularly significant because the church had been operated by a religious organization that had maintained detailed records of its activities. These records provided independent verification of some aspects of the network's operations that had previously been known only through federal investigations. They also revealed the network had operated for a longer period and in more locations than had been previously documented. Analysis of the church documents revealed that the network had been in operation since at least the 1930s and had served thousands of clients over more than 2 decades. The documents also showed that the network had been remarkably well organized, with standardized procedures, trained personnel, and sophisticated security measures that had enabled it to operate for years without detection. More importantly, the church documents contained information about the network's leadership structure that had not been available during the original investigations. The documents revealed that the network had been controlled by a small group of individuals who maintained oversight of operations throughout the country while remaining carefully insulated from direct involvement in day-to-day activities. These leaders had been identified only by code names in network communications, and their real identities remained unknown. However, the documents provided enough information about their roles and responsibilities to suggest that they had been highly sophisticated criminals with extensive experience in organized crime and considerable financial resources. The discovery of the church documents led to a renewed federal investigation in 1999, though this investigation was limited in scope due to the advanced age of the case and the deaths of many potential witnesses. Federal investigators were able to identify several individuals who had been connected to the network and who were still alive, but most of these people claimed to have no memory of their involvement or refused to cooperate with the investigation. However, the investigation did produce one significant result. Analysis of the church documents led to the identification of a pattern of financial transactions that could be traced to legitimate businesses and individuals who had apparently provided funding for network operations. While most of these financial connections dated back several decades, some appeared to extend into the 1980s and 1990s, suggesting that components of the network might have continued operating long after the closure of facilities like Ravencrest Manor. This discovery led to a broader investigation of organized crime activities in Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Federal investigators identified several cases in which missing persons, identity fraud, and suspicious deaths might be connected to continuing network operations. However, proving these connections required evidence that was often unavailable due to the sophisticated methods used to conceal criminal activities. The investigation continued through 2001, when it was officially concluded due to resource limitations and the minimal likelihood of developing prosecutable cases. However, federal investigators acknowledged that many questions about the network remained unanswered and that components of the organization might still be active. Today, the residential neighborhood that occupies the former Ravencrest Manor site appears entirely normal, with no obvious traces of its criminal history. Most residents are unaware of the events that occurred there more than 60 years ago, and the case has largely faded from public memory. However, the Ravencrest Manor investigation continues to influence federal law enforcement approaches to organized crime and identity fraud. The case demonstrated the possibility that sophisticated criminal organizations could operate for extended periods in rural areas where law enforcement resources were limited and community customs emphasized privacy and non-interference. It also showed how criminal enterprises could exploit legitimate businesses and social institutions to conceal their activities while providing services that enabled other forms of criminal behavior. Perhaps most significantly, the Ravencrest Manor case illustrated the challenges that law enforcement faces when investigating criminal organizations that have been designed to survive the discovery and closure of individual components. The network's compartmentalized structure, sophisticated security measures, and detailed contingency planning had enabled it to continue operating even after significant portions of its infrastructure had been compromised. The lessons learned from the Ravencrest Manor investigation have influenced federal approaches to investigating organized crime and have contributed to the development of techniques for penetrating sophisticated criminal networks. However, the case also serves as a reminder that some criminal organizations may be sufficiently well-designed to remain beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement methods. The fate of Cordelia Ravencrest and the 8 individuals who disappeared with her remains unknown. Whether they were killed to protect network secrets, successfully relocated to other parts of the organization, or managed to escape entirely and assume new lives independent of criminal activity, their disappearance represents one of the most complete and successful vanishing acts in American criminal history. For residents of the neighborhood that now occupies the former Ravencrest Manor site, the knowledge of what once occurred there serves as a reminder that criminal activity can be concealed behind the most ordinary and respectable appearances. The case stands as one of Pennsylvania's most sophisticated documented examples of organized crime, operating for years in plain sight of a community that never suspected the true nature of the business being conducted in their midst. The echoes of what happened at Ravencrest Manor continue to influence how law enforcement agencies approach cases involving identity fraud, organized crime, and systematic criminal activity. Whether similar networks continue to operate in contemporary America using updated techniques to provide the same services that were offered by Cordelia Ravencrest's operation remains an open question that continues to concern federal investigators. The case also raises broader questions about the relationship between privacy, community customs, and criminal activity in American society. The factors that enabled the Ravencrest Manor network to operate successfully for years, geographic isolation, limited oversight, and cultural emphasis on privacy, remain characteristic of many rural communities throughout the United States. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ravencrest Manor case is not what was discovered about the criminal network, but what remains unknown about its operations, and the possibility that similar organizations continue to exist, operating beneath the surface of ordinary rural life. Serving clients whose need to disappear creates opportunities for those willing to profit from desperation and criminality. The case serves as a permanent reminder that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and some forms of criminal activity may be too well concealed to be completely understood or eliminated.